So something I wanted to comment on is the uh, very controversial case of Ron Jeremy. So since 2021, Ron Jeremy, the legendary porn actor, has been fighting a an ongoing legal battle, criminal legal battle against a large number of accusations against him from women, from everything from sexual harassment up to sexual assault and all-out rape. And so this is it's a very disturbing pattern of behavior. And out front now, obviously, um, the trial. I'll get into the problems with the trial in a moment, but the issue itself remains unresolved from a legal standpoint. Yes, he has a presumption of innocence until proven guilty in a court of law. However, my personal feeling in this is that I think a lot of, and I say a lot of obviously because I'm not privy to all information and all of the accusations, but from what I've been able to see in this, I think a lot of this is credible. There's a lot of credible accusations here against him, especially in light of some of the behavior that we've observed, that's been observed and documented since he's been incarcerated. So the reason, so as we look at this on a scale from as it comes to accusations against public figures and prominent men, on a scale from Johnny Depp to Harvey Weinstein, it looks like this one's more over closer to the Harvey Weinstein territory. And I say that because you have an emergent pattern of behavior over the course of many years, from accusations from unrelated women, and it seems to be that this is not, we're not talking, from the looks of it, we're not talking about anything that has been heavily coordinated among people, like what was done to Marilyn Manson, where it was you have at the heart of it a grifter that's trying to orchestrate some big publicity stunt against Marilyn Manson and things like that. And in the case of Marilyn Manson, if you've been following that case, the court, the accusations against him keep falling keep getting either dismissed or settled out of court. None of this, as we've been able to see, none of this has any real teeth to it. And that's the thing, when you're talking about a scam like what Ilma Gore tried to pull with Evan Rachel Wood, it's not going to have a lot of teeth in the actual court. The fact that this is getting to trial means that the prosecution feels that they have something that they can something that they can actually go forward with. So anyway, so that alone is very telling. But again, it is a pattern of behavior that seems consistent and reliable. So there's evidence to suggest that there really is something here. Also, I know people in the industry who have, and I will say just from private, I will just say that I've talked privately to people in the industry who say that Ron Jeremy, especially in recent years as he's gotten older, has had an increasing pattern of erratic behavior. And this is where it gets really interesting. So that increasing pattern of erratic behavior is very consistent with someone who's experiencing dementia. And if you've been following this case at all, you know that Ron Jeremy's case was suspended indefinitely because the judge ruled him legally incompetent to stand trial. The reason for that being that while he was in prison these last few years, his dementia has progressed to the point that he no longer recognizes even his own attorney. He has no idea what's going on, etc., etc. And I know that there will always be people who want to say, well, how do we know he's not faking it? Because there are medical and psychiatric professionals who can verify a diagnosis of dementia in a way that not Ron Jeremy or anyone else would be able to fake. My God, just stop jumping down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole every chance you get. It's usually just hard concrete at the bottom. Anyway, So, Mitzi is now sitting in front of my light. Is why the lighting suddenly changed. Anyway, so talking about that, so he's been ruled legally incompetent to stand trial, and so the court case is suspended indefinitely. Now, let's say that Ron Jeremy at some point improved and he was once more competent to stand trial. The charges against him will never be dismissed. If he's ever competent to stand trial, he will be required to uh, come back to court and face charges and face justice. Assist in his own defense and possibly face justice. That said, dementia only goes one way, and Ron Jeremy is never going to be competent to stand trial. And as I've been following on X, I've noticed a number of female porn stars have spoken out, have been aghast at the news that Ron Jeremy has been released from prison. And on the surface, I certainly understand why you would be enraged by that, especially if you've had some negative encounter with him. I totally understand that. There's a few things I wanted to point out here and I wanted to talk about. First of all, to be very clear, Ron Jeremy has not been released out into the world. This is not a case of a known hardened sex criminal being released out into the world to go back to his old ways, facing no punishment and no justice whatsoever. That is not what has happened. I realize that it is probably for the people the victims that want to see justice, and for the people who sympathize with them. I realize that this seems like an anticlimax. It does feel like you're not getting the justice that you want. But trust me when I say, as someone who lost his grandfather to Alzheimer's, someone who has seen other loved ones deal with dementia as well, trust me when I say that advanced dementia is a hell and a prison of its own design, like you can't imagine. And there's a few things that have to be considered there. First of all, this is already a very old man. He's 70 years old. It is, in a lot of states, it's common practice to have a geriatric wing for elderly convicts, which is a facility more like a nursing home, just because people that old, it's totally inhumane, cruel and unusual punishment to leave someone that old in the general population with the garden variety the garden variety liquor store robbers and knife wielding murderers and all of that stuff. It is just or shank wielding murderers and all of that. It is totally inhumane and totally unreasonable, and it was doubly inhumane and unreasonable to put someone experiencing dementia in that situation. Now, I know that, this is why I wanted to bring this up. I know that there is a strong feeling that any mercy that's shown to someone who would do such vile things is somehow a hindrance to justice. But we as a civilized society have to have checks and balances on how we hand out justice, because we as a civilized society decided that we're going to do better than just give in to our base urges, even when it comes to things like meting out justice to horribly vile people. So it's already now that, compacted with the fact that the trial cannot legally continue, and this is part of making sure that we never enact cruel and unusual punishment on people, is in order for someone to stand trial, they have to, one, be legally competent to assist in their own defense. And two, if they are punished, they have to be legally, mentally competent enough to understand what they've done wrong and why they are being punished. Ron Jeremy does not have the capacity to understand anything anymore. And that gets me to my next point, or brings me back to my first point about how a lot of this assault behavior, uh, people, one in particular that I talked to in the industry, told me that Ron was having blackout issues and issues of losing time where 1 minute you're doing one thing and then all of a sudden you're somewhere else and you don't know how you got, and X amount of time has passed and you don't know how you got there. And that is something that could be is consistent with the onset of dementia. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Even if it is consistent with the onset of dementia, he is still legally responsible for his behavior, and even if he is ruled legally incompetent and irresponsible for his behavior, that behavior still cannot be allowed to continue. That is unacceptable behavior. No one, or at least no one on this side of this camera, is trying to make any kind of apology for that. He must not be allowed to victimize anybody. But I'm trying to put this in perspective because mental health topics are important to me, and proper care and treatment for the mentally ill is important to me. And I say that especially because I've commented recently on people like Michael Knowles and Candace Owens, who pundits who talk about basically wanting to treat mentally ill people like animals, wanting to treat them as subhuman in subhuman ways, and essentially deny them human rights and their humanity in general. And it's absolutely vile and disgusting and heartbreaking what they're calling for. And that's concerning to me. And it is very easy as a society to go off the rails and start punishing people in a way that is intended to give us visceral satisfaction rather than actually objectively step back and determine what's the best course of action in a given situation. So, bringing it back around to the assault and lost time issue, Ron Jeremy, they've been trying to find a care facility, a private care facility like a nursing home that will take him, but they've been having problems with him assaulting the orderlies. I don't know if that just means punching them or groping them or what have you, but that's been an issue. So they can't find a private care facility to take him. And the reason they have to orchestrate something with a private care facility is because they cannot legally have him incarcerated forever, having committed no crime. He was in pretrial detention. And so if they are in a situation where he can never stand trial, then he can't remain incarcerated indefinitely at that point. And so what they've tried to do, what they've worked out, I've been reading up on what they've planned to do. And what they're doing is they've worked out a guardianship, I believe they even used the word conservatorship, but a guardianship in a private home facility where the person paying for Ron Jeremy's care is going to hire male orderlies that can physically overpower him if he assaults them. In the description of his current state of health, they said that he is basically bedridden and is not physically capable of leaving a house. So you are talking about someone who you're talking about a very elderly, terminally ill man that is going to be wasting away in a hospital bed that's been moved into someone's house. I say all of this because this is not like turning R. Kelly loose on the street, just escaping punishment or something like that. I realize that for many people, especially those that are directly seeking justice in all of this, it feels anticlimactic and it lacks the vindicating satisfaction that you were hoping it would have. But we as a society, this is a situation where we as a society have to choose to do better. Then sometimes we have to choose to do better, and choosing to do better and appeal to our better nature is often not easy. It's often not what we want to do. It's what we recognize is the right course of action. And we talk about all of the issues. There are so many issues with prisons in this country, especially privately owned prisons, which is a nightmare all its own. But It is just not. It is just not humane to put a terminally ill elderly man in general population incarceration with young, virile, and violent inmates and that sort of thing. This is not a man, again, this is not a man that is being released back onto the street to return to his evil ways. This is just a man who's basically in house arrest and basically going through house arrest and in the process of dying. He's not going to get better. He's only going to get worse. And that's why I want to tell you something about dementia. Having, when my grandfather died of Alzheimer's, by the time he had put in his will that if there was no quality of life and no reasonable expectation that he could ever recover, he wanted to be humanely euthanized or whatever the more correct term is, but he wanted to be allowed to die. He was in Mississippi, where the only way they could legally allow him to die was to let him starve to death, which I think is horrible. Now, granted, they had him on all kinds of medication, sedatives and everything, so he really wasn't aware of what was going on. But they had to just let him starve and dehydrate to death. And if he asked for water, the only thing they could do was rub a sponge on his lips. Which I think is I drawing it out like that is horrible to me. So the point being, though, when he got to that point where when he was in the final stages of Alzheimer's, he was waking up terrified every single day, waking up terrified because he had no idea where he was. He didn't know what was going on. He did not recognize anybody, and he was fighting with everybody and terrified every day because he had no idea what was going on or where he was or who he was or anything. And that is a level of terror and suffering that is a prison all its own. So Ron Jeremy has not escaped from anything just because he's going to be going through that private hell in the guest bedroom of someone's house somewhere, rather than in a cell at a prison. I know you want him to suffer. Trust me, he is suffering more than any he is suffering more than you would ever want even a scumbag like that to suffer. And it's only going to get worse. I've seen, again, like I said, I've seen what dementia can do. It's terrifying. There is a high likelihood that I'll have to confront it at the end of my life. And it's like, if you had a choice to die any other way, if you had a choice to die any other way, you would, and if you've seen what dementia can do to somebody, if you had a choice to die any other way, you would probably die that way. I mean, even with, I'm not, now don't get me wrong, these are also horrible, these other terminal illnesses I'm describing are also horrible ways to die that I wouldn't wish on anybody. But just by a matter of degrees, think about this. Even with cancer and AIDS and things like that, there's at least a high likelihood that you'll retain your cognitive faculties up to the end. I know with, we don't hear about AIDS deaths as much anymore because it's treatable as a chronic condition now. But, go back in those days, there would be issues right before death where people would be losing their sight and losing their cognitive capacity. But even that's not guaranteed, So even in these other illnesses, these other horrible, devastating illnesses, you at least know who you are. You at least know who other people are. You have the capacity to say goodbye to your loved ones. You're not, you're not terrified every day because you don't know where you are. And again, it's that I'm not saying that you would rather, you would opt to have any of these conditions happen. I'm just saying, like, it is, dementia is a hell all its own, and it's a prison all its own. And trust me, if you want him to suffer, he is. Um, it's very sad story, And branching off from that, it is kind of an interesting thought of, like, you know, a porn star dies. It's like an adult film star dies. It's kind of like, if you were in the position of someone like a Marilyn Chambers or something like that, or at least there's, in her case, there's kind of some glamour and glory and that sort of thing. And the thing is, though, most adult film stars get out of the industry long before they're old enough to die of old age or of health conditions associated with the elderly. Obviously, most adult film stars work while they're in their prime and then go do other things once they've reached middle age and beyond. And so it's such an odd, interesting thing, or it's just such an odd, interesting thing to think about, because um, Ron Jeremy was never, somebody that, obviously, he was never somebody that was attractive. He was one of these people, if you look back at the early days of porn, obviously, the majority audience for heterosexual porn is men. And when porn started going mainstream, when it went out of the realm of underground, movies, and it became a mainstream thing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where people they were actually opening adult film, adult theaters and everything like that. And you had actual stars emerging, like Linda Lovelace and that sort of thing. Bambi Woods, before she disappeared off the face of the earth, and all of that. When you had actual stars emerging, there was actually, early on, the studios were not hiring like buff, good-looking, handsome, muscular men to do the male parts. They were hiring plain, homely, and even somewhat ugly men to do the male parts in a lot of cases, because they assumed that they assumed that people would want, they assumed that men would want to see relatable everyman type guys, average Joes, because that's who average Joes were the ones that were paying to see these movies. And so, rather than put, super handsome, attractive men in these movies, they got these very nerdy and homely looking guys like Ron Jeremy. Now, what ultimately happened was, as they started to kind of do market research, they found out that no, that's actually not what the straight men want to see. That even because they're not, just because they're not there to be, they're not, just because they're not interested in the male talent, they're interested in the female talent sexually. Even so, they don't want to see somebody that's off-putting to look at. They would much rather see, the statue of David, something more akin to that. And so they started going towards more traditionally attractive, handsome men in the parts. But anyway, that's how Ron Jeremy got into the industry. He got into the industry as a novelty. And that's what keeps coming back to me, is like, what an odd legacy to leave behind. Like, it would be one thing if he had dashing good looks and everything, and was, revered as like a sex symbol, like a Fabio type person or something. That would be one legacy to leave behind. But what an odd legacy to leave behind. The legacy of being someone who got into porn because he was a nerdy, homely looking everyman. This is a side tangent, obviously, but it's such an odd thing to think about. Like, he's not capable of looking back on his life. He's at this point, I'm sure he's forgotten nearly all of his life at this point. But if you were in a position to look back on your life, it's such an odd thing to, it's such an odd life to look back on. Like I said, if you were a sex symbol, you know, if you were Jenna Jameson, that would be one thing, or Sasha Grey or something like that. But yeah, it's such a weird thing. It's like, you know, you were a novelty act in the adult film industry. That's a side tangent. But as it stands, like I said, my heart and my sympathy goes out to everyone that is angered by the feeling of justice not being served. I get that. I'm not trying to diminish your feelings at all. But what I am trying to say is, you know, there are there are some larger humanitarian mechanisms in our justice system that need to kick in at a point like this so that we do not become a cruel and vicious people in the way we mete out justice. And then on top of that, like I said, you know, he's in prison. Even if he's rotting away in a bed in somebody's guest room, he's in prison and he's going to stay there. Don't worry.